The look on Patricia's face as I slowly backed my 26-foot Sea-Ray, my driveway, was absolutely priceless. Her eyes bulged, her mouth agape, as the gleaming white hull reflected the afternoon sunlight directly into her living room window. The boat trailer creaked satisfyingly as I positioned it perfectly centered on the concrete, making sure the bow pointed directly at her front door like an accusatory finger. When I honked the horn twice in celebration, I swear I could see the vein in her forehead throbbing from 30 feet away. After months of her tyrannical rule over our neighborhood, watching her completely powerless to stop me was sweeter than I ever could have imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this all started. 6 months ago, I finally achieved my dream of moving to Lake Harmony Estates, a beautiful waterfront community with picturesque views and direct access to Crystal Lake. After 15 years of saving, countless overtime shifts, and more sacrifices than I care to admit, I purchased a modest 3-bedroom home just 3 blocks from the communal dock. The neighborhood seemed perfect, manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and most importantly, a place where I could finally enjoy my newfound passion for boating. 2 weeks after moving in, I purchased what I affectionately named Freedom Finder, a used but well-maintained 26-foot Sea-Ray that represented everything I had worked for. Nothing extravagant, just a reliable vessel to take my family out on weekend trips to enjoy the water. Little did I know that this modest boat would become the center of a neighborhood war. The first warning letter appeared on my door exactly 3 days after I brought the boat home. Notice of violation, unauthorized vehicle storage, it read in bold red letters. According to the Homeowners Association rules, apparently no recreational vehicles could be visible from the street. This was strange, as I had specifically asked my realtor about boat storage before purchasing and was assured it was permitted so long as it was on my property. In fact, she had pointed out several other homes with boats during our neighborhood tour, mentioning it as one of the community's perks. That evening, I carefully read through the HOA handbook and confirmed my suspicion. Boats were allowed on private property if they were maintained in good condition and parked on an appropriate surface. My boat was spotless and parked on a concrete pad I had specifically installed for this purpose. I even found a photograph in the handbook showing an acceptable boat storage arrangement, which looked remarkably similar to my own setup. There was absolutely no basis for the violation notice. The next morning, I called the HOA office to politely explain the misunderstanding, expecting a quick resolution. The receptionist sounded friendly enough, but her tone shifted immediately when I mentioned the boat violation. "You'll need to speak with Patricia about that," she said, transferring my call without another word. That's when I first encountered Patricia Wilkerson, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood dictator. With her perfectly coiffed silver bob and perpetually pinched expression, she exuded authority before speaking a single word. "I don't care what your realtor told you," she snapped through the phone, her voice dripping with condescension. "That boat is an eyesore and violates our aesthetic standards." When I attempted to reference the specific bylaw allowing boats, she interrupted. "Those rules are subject to interpretation by the board, and as president, I am telling you that your interpretation is incorrect." Before I could argue further, she informed me that I had 7 days to remove the boat or face a $100 daily fine. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me mid-sentence. I was bewildered by the hostility. Everything about my boat storage was legal, not just by local regulations but by the HOA's own written rules. Still trying to be a good neighbor, I spent the weekend building a tasteful wooden fence around the concrete pad to minimize the boat's visibility from the street. The fence matched my house perfectly, was within height regulations, and I even planted some decorative shrubs around it. I photographed the improvements and sent them to the HOA office with a note explaining my compliance efforts. Problem solved, I thought. I was wrong. The harassment only intensified over the following weeks. Patricia began documenting my violations with daily photographs, sometimes standing in my driveway for up to 30 minutes waiting for the perfect incriminating. She claimed the fence was unauthorized, it wasn't, that the boat exceeded height restrictions, it didn't, and even that the color of my boat, Standard white was not in harmony with neighborhood aesthetics. Each week brought new citations, each more ridiculous than the last. Excessive recreational equipment, one read. Another claimed improper storage of water vessel. My favorite was creating a navigational hazard on my own property, nowhere near the actual lake. My once peaceful existence had transformed into a constant battle. Neighbors began avoiding me, not because they agreed with Patricia, but because they feared becoming her next target if they showed me support. I later learned she had built quite the reputation for vindictive enforcement, targeting anyone who challenged her authority. The Johnsons had questioned a fence height rule and subsequently received violations for their basketball hoop, mailbox, and even their garden gnomes. The Delgados had their greenhouse request denied 3 times after disputing Patricia's interpretation of the exterior paint palette. Once you were on Patricia's radar, you stayed there indefinitely. The fines started accumulating at an alarming rate, $100 for the first violation, $200 for the second, $500 for continued non-compliance. I tried appealing through proper channels but discovered Patricia herself was the head of the appeals committee. Threatening letters appeared almost daily, and Patricia even began organizing HOA meetings specifically to discuss the boat situation on Lakeview Drive. My dream home was becoming a nightmare, and my weekends on the water were overshadowed by the constant stress of returning to Patricia's next creative violation. After 3 months of this treatment, I decided to fight back formally. I consulted an attorney who specialized in property disputes and HOA law. Laura Mendez was a petite woman with a reputation for taking on overreaching homeowners associations and winning. She reviewed my documentation, the HOA's bylaws, and Patricia's violation notices with increasing amusement. "This is one of the clearest cases of selective enforcement I've seen," she chuckled, shaking her head. "The HOA president is operating way beyond her authority." Laura confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had no grounds to prohibit my boat as long as it met the conditions outlined in their documentation, which it absolutely did. We drafted a carefully worded legal notice demanding that the harassment cease immediately and that all illegitimate fines be rescinded. The letter also hinted at potential legal action for harassment and selective enforcement if the behavior continued. I hand-delivered this letter to the HOA office, making sure to keep a notarized copy for my records. Patricia's response was immediate and furious. She called an emergency HOA meeting that very evening, where she painted me as a reckless rule-breaker determined to destroy property values and turn our prestigious community into a marina parking lot. When I attempted to speak in my defense, she had my microphone cut off. When I tried again, she threatened to have me removed from the meeting for disruptive behavior. It was becoming clear that this wasn't about rules at all. It was about control, and Patricia couldn't tolerate anyone challenging her authority. The situation might have continued indefinitely if not for a stroke of incredible luck. While researching property values to counter Patricia's claims about my boat affecting the neighborhood, I stumbled across a new real estate listing that made me do a double take. There on my computer screen was Patricia's house, listed for sale at a surprisingly reasonable price, with an urgent timeline noted in the description. Motivated seller, quick closing preferred, all reasonable offers considered. Which was strikingly different from other properties in our desirable neighborhood. My curiosity piqued. I did some digging through public records. What I discovered revealed what Patricia had been hiding from the community. She was deeply in debt and facing potential foreclosure. There had been a tax lien filed against her property 6 months ago, and a notice of default on her second mortgage had been filed just last week. The house needed to sell quickly, and she had been keeping this information carefully guarded from her neighbors to maintain her image of authority and success. In that moment, a plan formed that was so perfect, so poetically just, that I could hardly believe it might work. I contacted my financial advisor immediately to discuss liquidating some investments. Then I reached out to my attorney again, this time to establish a limited liability company with a generic, unmemorable name. Within 48 hours, Lakeside Property Holdings LLC was born, with my identity carefully concealed behind layers of paper. Next, I had my real estate agent contact Patricia's listing agent with an offer, full asking price, all cash, with a 15-day closing period. No inspection contingencies, no financing delays, the kind of offer that would be nearly impossible to refuse for someone in financial distress. 2 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and anticipation. During this time, Patricia continued her campaign against my boat with renewed vigor, perhaps sensing her window of authority closing. The irony of her not knowing I was the anonymous buyer of her home made each new threat letter all the more satisfying. When closing day finally arrived, I signed the final documents remotely to maintain my anonymity. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I officially owned Patricia Wilkerson's house. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. What happened next required precise timing and execution. My attorney delivered the eviction notice to Patricia the following morning, a legal 30-day requirement to vacate the premises now that ownership had changed hands. The document was deliberately vague about the new owner, simply stating that Lakeside Property Holdings LLC requires possession of the property for business purposes. According to my attorney, who delivered the papers, Patricia's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally rage as she realized what was happening. She immediately began making frantic phone calls, attempting to discover who was behind the company and whether there was any way to reverse the sale. There wasn't. The following weeks were a masterclass in righteous satisfaction as I watched from a distance while Patricia's life unraveled. She attempted to challenge the eviction but quickly discovered the sale was legally binding and completely legitimate. She organized an emergency HOA meeting to discuss her situation, ironically seeking support from the same community members she had terrorized for years. Few attended. She even attempted to fast-track new HOA regulations about property sales, but without her own home to use as a power base, her influence was already waning. Reality was setting in. She had 30 days to pack up her life and leave. On the 29th day after receiving the eviction notice, Patricia was still hurriedly moving her possessions into a rental truck. I waited patiently until I observed her loading what appeared to be the last of her furniture before making my move. I had deliberately kept my boat in storage during this time, away from my home and out of Patricia's sight. Now, with perfect dramatic timing, I drove slowly down the street, my boat in tow, directly toward Patricia's, now my, house. The moment she recognized my vehicle, then my face, and finally connected the dots about who had purchased her home was absolutely everything I had hoped it would be. I parked my truck at the curb and stepped out, legal documents in hand. "Good afternoon, Patricia," I called out cheerfully as I approached. "I believe this is the final day of your occupancy. I'm eager to take possession of my new property." The color drained from her face as realization dawned. "You?" she gasped, her voice barely audible. "You bought my house? This is harassment." I smiled politely and shook my head. "Not at all. This is a perfectly legal real estate transaction. I'm simply a homeowner in the neighborhood who appreciated the value of your property." I gestured to my boat. "And I'm particularly fond of the spacious driveway, which, according to HOA bylaws, is perfectly suitable for boat storage, as long as it's on an appropriate surface." Patricia's face contorted with fury as she watched me begin to back my boat into the driveway, her driveway just hours earlier. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, drawing the attention of several neighbors who had begun to gather, sensing the unfolding drama. "I am the president of this." "Actually, Patricia," I interrupted calmly, continuing to position my boat with deliberate care, making sure it was perfectly centered. "I've reviewed all the relevant bylaws very carefully. This boat, on this proper." I parked my truck at the curb, legal documents in hand. "Good afternoon, Brenda," I called out cheerfully as I approached. "I believe this is the final day of your occupancy. I'm eager to take possession of my new property." The color drained from her face as realization dawned. "You?" she gasped, her voice barely audible. "You bought my house? This is harassment." I smiled politely and shook my head. Not at all. This is a perfectly legal real estate transaction. I'm simply a homeowner in the neighborhood who appreciated the value of your property. I gestured to my boat. And I'm particularly fond of the spacious driveway, which, according to HOA bylaws, is perfectly suitable for boat storage, as long as it's on an appropriate surface. Brenda's face contorted with fury as she watched me begin to back my boat into the driveway, her driveway, just hours earlier. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, drawing the attention of several neighbors who had begun to gather, sensing the unfolding drama. "I am the president of this HOA. I will have you fined. I will have your boat towed." I continued positioning my boat with deliberate care, making sure it was perfectly centered. "Actually, Brenda, I've reviewed all the relevant bylaws very carefully. This boat, on this property, violates absolutely no rules. And as the legal owner of this property, I have every right to store my boat here." I pulled out a copy of the HOA regulations and held it up. "Feel free to check for yourself. Everything is completely by the book." The neighbors watched in stunned silence as Brenda's tantrum escalated. She stormed toward the boat, phone in hand, threatening to call the police, the HOA board, her attorney, anyone who might help her reclaim her lost authority. But with each empty threat, her position weakened. The police would confirm this was a civil matter. The HOA board would verify I was within my rights. Her attorney would remind her that she had willingly sold the property. For perhaps the first time in years, Brenda Miller, age 58, was completely powerless in her own neighborhood. As Brenda finally ran out of threats and stood speechless before her former home, I approached her with one final document, a copy of all the illegitimate violation notices she had issued me over the previous months. "I believe these are no longer applicable," I said quietly, tearing them in half. "And I've taken the liberty of informing the HOA board about the selective enforcement and harassment issues we've discussed. They seemed quite interested in reviewing your conduct as president." Without waiting for her response, I turned and walked toward my new front door, keys in hand. Behind me, I heard the rental truck door slam and the engine start, as Brenda realized there was nothing more she could do. That evening, as I sat on the front porch of my new acquisition, watching the sunset reflect off my boat's gleaming hull, neighbors I had barely spoken to before stopped by, one after another. Some brought welcome baskets, others bottles of wine. All shared their own Brenda stories: years of petty tyranny, selective enforcement, and retribution against anyone who questioned her authority. Far from damaging property values, as Brenda had claimed, my boat had become a symbol of liberation for a neighborhood too long held hostage by one person's need for control. Within a week, 3 other boats appeared in driveways throughout the community, their owners finally free to enjoy their properties as the rules actually allowed. As for Brenda's former home, I had already found the perfect investment property, complete with ideal tenants, a cheerful family of 5. This included 2 teenagers, both active members of the high school sailing team. Their lease agreement explicitly allowed them to store their 2 small sailing dinghies in the driveway, a detail I made absolutely sure was airtight and fully compliant with all Homeowners Association (HOA) regulations. We even included photographs of the boats as exhibits in the contract, along with copies of the relevant HOA bylaws permitting such storage. To be extra safe, I had the agreement reviewed by a second attorney who specialized in HOA law, ensuring it was completely bulletproof against any potential issues. The day they moved in felt like a neighborhood celebration. They positioned their colorful boats prominently on the property, one a bright blue with white trim, the other a sunny yellow with the high school logo emblazoned on its sail. Neighbors brought welcome gifts and helped carry furniture. Children gathered around to admire the sailing dinghies, asking all sorts of questions about how they worked and if they could see them on the water sometime. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. As the family carefully placed their boats exactly where Eleanor's prized rose bushes had once been, there was an almost palpable sense of a new chapter beginning. Within a month, Other boats started appearing throughout the neighborhood. The retired Navy officer down on Shoreline Drive finally brought home the small fishing boat he'd wanted for years. The young couple on Lakeside Avenue proudly displayed their kayaks on a newly installed rack. Even the Johnson family boldly parked their jet ski in their side yard after years of battling Eleanor over it. Each new vessel represented not just a recreational choice, but a reclaiming of reasonable property rights. At the next HOA meeting, which had record attendance, the board unanimously voted to create clear, fair guidelines for boat storage that would apply consistently to all residents. The new president, who succeeded Eleanor, emphasized that the HOA existed to maintain community standards through transparent processes, not to enable personal vendettas. I could almost feel Eleanor's distant fury as the nautical rebellion I had inadvertently started continued to flourish. The message to the community was clear: the rules would now be enforced fairly, consistently, and according to what was actually written, not according to one person's interpretation. And that message, like my tenants' boats, wasn't going anywhere.